whiskey sipping, 2 cigars smoking, conspiracy talking, blow the gates open. Famous people, we talking about the knowledge and the truth right here, no doubt.
Oh, Matt, you're going to love it. It's so tight. That's what I can say about it. It's so tight.
I look forward to hearing it.
Yes, I'm sure you do. So once we
when we can,
once we get this up online, you'll finally hear your intro. And I don't know if I told you about this, but what I'm going to do is for all of the other guests, kind of the regulars, to start joining us. Each time someone does, the goal is a minimum of 3. So as soon as they do their 4th episode, tonight's your 4th episode. As soon as someone does 3 episodes, I will get them a theme song that I will play each time that they join us from their 4th episode on. Does that make sense? So.
Yeah, and here I thought I was just really special and got my own theme song.
But you're first, and no one can ever take that away from you.
It's not the first time I'm your first either.
All right, so Matt, tonight's episode, we're talking about Paranormal State, and which you're familiar with. And of course, we did all the Chad Kalick stuff, and we'll see if during our conversation, if anything that we want to mention about the Chad Kalick documentaries wants to come up. But we're going to focus on Ryan Buell and his team. But what I want to do, this is the first time that you watch this particular episode, so you hadn't seen this episode until tonight. Tell me your first impression, your first thoughts after watching Season 1, Episode 16, The Asylum.
So unfortunately, I'm kind of going into this a little more skeptical than I would have when I watched them. Oh gosh, I can't remember how many years ago. And so I think that's one of the things I was thinking the whole time is that, man, I wish I'd have seen this episode 7 or 8 years ago, whenever it was out, and then wish that I was watching it again today and just remembering the difference. I don't want to get too much into it now, but having seen so many of Chad and even Ryan's stuff at a later age, it just gave me a completely different perspective. And as we progress here, and for those that haven't heard the first 3 podcasts, can probably guess what I'm getting at. As we progress here, you'll get a better sense of what I mean by that. So it's hard to say my initial reactions without giving a spoiler there. But my initial reactions can probably be anticipated by the loyal listener who heard our Chad Kalick series. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Fair enough. So let me give a little bit of background. So this is Season 1, Episode 16. And for the viewers at home, or the listeners at home, sorry, the reason why I picked this episode, first of all, I was basically just trying to go on YouTube. While I won't be shy about it, I do have the entire Paranormal State box set DVD collection, and I can watch any episode at any time. Matt's at home, so Matt's not joining me live in studio for this one. So I wanted an episode that Matt could go home and watch on YouTube for us to discuss, and I specifically wanted to find one that basically had all the right ingredients. And that is, of course, something with dead time, something basically that involved chip coffee. So I was specifically looking for an episode with chip coffee. I also wanted to find an early episode if possible, so I wanted to go back to Season 1 and see if I could find a Season 1 episode with chip coffee. If there's anything that mentioned, where they were encountering demons, if anybody was introduced as a demonologist. And this had all the ingredients. Chip Coffee's in this one. Lorraine Warren is in this one. There is another actual self-proclaimed medium in this one. There's the Frank's Ghost Box, which we'll get to. And of course, at the end, they pretty quickly make everything all better, and the happy music kicks in. So it has all the ingredients of your Paranormal State formula, so that's why I chose this one, Season 1, Episode 16, The Asylum. So, with that introduction, basically this is about the Willard Drug Treatment Center in Willard, New York. So they head up to Willard, New York, and go to the Willard Drug Treatment Center. It was a former New York State mental institution. So it used to be a mental institution. And basically they were called up because the manager there, the superintendent actually called them because he was saying that staff members were hearing and seeing activity, and they were just kind of getting nervous and didn't really want to stay at the facility. A little bit of background, the facility was built originally in 1860, and the one interesting story that we learned as the show begins is Dr. Willard. He was a psychiatrist. He's the one that wanted to turn the facility specifically into an insane asylum. And he went to the New York State legislature to ask them if it could be turned into a state insane asylum. And while he was asking them, he died of a heart attack in front of the New York State legislature. Do you remember that?
You know what? I don't remember that part.
Oh, you don't remember him mentioning that at the beginning?
No, totally missed that.
Yeah, it was real quick. It was as the superintendent was kind of giving them the introduction and like showing them the place, and then he was saying how the employees, would hear a woman screaming and stuff like that, and they got scared and left.
I remember all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I must have been writing down something. I remember all of that. I just do not remember him saying that the guy who went to go present to have it listed as the state mental facility died of a heart attack.
Yeah,
that part I do not remember.
Yeah, no. The one thing before I get too far along. What were your first impressions? Do you remember when they went to the basically the graveyard on the property?
Yeah, I mean, when they went to the graveyard on the property, they mentioned that, he asked the superintendent if these people had a proper burial. And this is actually key for me to point out. He asked whether or not they had a proper burial, and the superintendent said, "I don't know, I wasn't there."
Mm-hmm.
And the part that sort of stuck out to me on that was, one, what's the difference between a proper burial? I mean, they didn't just dig a trench and dump them in and pour lye on top of them. I mean, it looks like they were buried with respect, or at least, and you and I can attest to this because we've worked in the field, literally, that you can't just, you have certain state guidelines you have to follow. You can't just dump a body. I mean, I'm sure that they're in coffins. I'm sure that they're in vaults, at least, after a certain point in time. So
mm-hmm.
I'm not exactly sure, one, why Ryan felt like that was a necessary question at the time. And two, I don't know, I guess in my mind it's just sort of what prompted him to ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an obvious answer. Maybe they didn't have a glorious funeral like a celebrity's funeral where the whole world is there and watching.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure they had, I'm sure they were buried with, at least the amount of respect required by law.
Yeah, and now this also starts getting into basically where what a lot of I'm trying to think what word, a lot of the flack, or a lot of the accusations, I should say. A lot of the accusations that Paranormal State got after it was kind of done is that basically, it was an A&E produced show. So there was an entire production team behind these episodes, and the A&E would send out scouts to the locations first. They would go out before Ryan and his team. It's not a documentary about Ryan and his team. It's a television show, okay? That's what you got to remember. So, A&E would send scouts to these locations. They would make phone calls and get all the facts and stories. And it's obviously not presented that way. It's presented like Ryan and his team show up, and them and us, the viewer, are just getting this information coming to light at that moment. And in the reality, that's not the case. So, when you watch this show, to me, the underlining theme, you start to realize all these accusations were basically they go into these shows, they already know what storyline they're aiming for. So they already knew going there that the storyline was going to be, well, we're just going to say that there's ghosts that are stuck here, that we're going to tie it into the graveyard, that they need our help, so we're going to help them, and then we'll do a funeral at the end. Because, and as we go through that, I think a lot of that will become self-evident. So, but Matt, I'm going to take a second here. As I mentioned, you're not going to hear the audio, but I'm going to play a few seconds. So if you hold tight, I'm going to play for the listeners the scene real quick where Ryan is shown the cemetery and what you just discussed is said. So hang tight. I'm going to go ahead and play that now for the listeners at home.
All right, perfect.
This is the cemetery for the psych center. These are all patients.
These are patients?
These are all patients. There's well over 5,000 people that are buried up here.
This whole field right here.
Everything you see is all cemetery.
Wow.
Everywhere.
They're all unmarked.
Well, that's what they did. When people died, there was no one who really cared about them.
Were they at least given some sort of proper memorial service, or were they just dumped in a hole?
Wasn't here. I do not know.
Okay, so Matt, I'll bring you back in, and they go through the conversation where Ryan asks, were they given a proper burial, and the guy just basically says, I don't know, I wasn't here. And suddenly they just take that, the rest of the show just assumes that they weren't. Do you know what I mean? And of course, and that's...
First of all,
go ahead.
So Fred, I can actually hear, surprisingly, I could actually hear that clip.
Really?
As you played it, yeah, so I don't know if that...
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, it does make a difference. Okay, that's
awesome.
Yeah,
no, that was awesome.
Okay.
So one of the things that sort of got me there, he mentioned exactly what I just mentioned. He asked him whether they were given a proper burial or whether they were sort of just dumped in a hole. and you can attest to this as much as I can, and obviously New York's different than Pennsylvania, where you and I dug graves. You can't just dump bodies into a hole. There are actually laws against that. There are, sanitation laws against that.
Now, just to be on the fair side, I don't. When he's saying a proper burial, I don't think he means that where the body's dug correctly. I think he means like spiritually, religiously. Like, it's one thing to like put it in the ground properly, like in a casket, in a what do you call it, a vault. I don't think that's what he meant. I think he meant like, did anybody give any like last rites or pray over it? That's what they're getting at.
And he followed it up. And I'm glad I could hear this, because he followed it up by saying, or were they just dumped in a hole?
Right. Well, yeah, yep, you got it.
And I guess in his mind, maybe he's not picturing the same thing. I'm picturing, they've got big trenches built, and they just dump them in with bulldozers, pour lye on top of them, and then throw more bodies on top of that, and then eventually some dirt. I guess maybe that's not what he means by by where they just dumped in a hole. Mm-hmm. Maybe you're right. Maybe he was referring to strictly the spiritual aspect, but I interpreted that as the physical aspect, and maybe that was on. Yeah,
I think I think he definitely means the spiritual aspect. But I want to move forward. But basically the reason I wanted to take a second and just go over this is I just want to set the tone for the rest of our commentary on this. That basically they are beginning to lay the groundwork for what their story is of this. Okay, so basically they're beginning to build their case. Oh, that there's spirits here. They need us to come and help them move along. And one of the reasons is because of this. They were obviously just put in the ground without a proper burial, even though they don't even know that that's the case. Okay, but they're just assuming that for this. But they have to in order to tell this story that they've developed. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and it's something I made a note of as we proceed through what happens in this episode. I made a note of something that is going to make that beginning scene and that beginning sequence, it's not really the beginning, but after the tour, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That sequence make a little more sense, because to me it was just a very odd question for him to have asked when I got a tour of St. Vincent, right, they showed me the cemetery with all of the monks. Mm-hmm. My first question wasn't, were they just dumped there? Right. Because let's face it, the monks probably didn't have a whole lot of family there either.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
I wasn't just my first take wasn't, obviously it's a Catholic atmosphere, so I guess maybe my mind made the natural assumption that they had a fair burial, but it wasn't the first thing that came to my mind on any cemetery I've ever been to.
Well, let's get even more. Let's even get more specific with that. You and I used to work in a graveyard with very similar circumstances. In the graveyard, if you remember, there was lots A, B, C, and D, and then there was the crypts, but there was plot A. Okay. In section, or they called them sections. Section A, there was a huge section of Section A that had no stones, but there was bodies buried all over it. And that's because similar thing, just like this insane asylum, this was, you go back a couple hundred years ago, this was a monastery out, middle of the woods, Latrobe or whatever, like the sick and the dying and the poor or whatever, the homeless, the sick and the dying would just show up at a monastery, or people would just drop off the sick and the dying in a monastery, because where else do you take them? What else do you do with them? They can't take care of themselves, so they would just show up at a monastery, and when these people died, the monks had to do something. And oftentimes they didn't even know these people's names, so they put them in the ground. So Section A at St. Vincent is full of unmarked graves because they didn't know these people's names. There was not, these were people that basically were on almost already on death's bed when they showed up, and then they just put them in the ground. But as you're saying, it's not like we ever looked at that and be like, were they given a proper burial? You know what I mean? Like, just like you're saying, that's not the first reaction. But again, it's beginning to set it's just beginning to show that they already have a predetermined story. That's all I'm getting at here.
Let's put it this way: without knowing the ending, as a viewer who's watching that for the first time, without knowing the ending, but knowing how these guys tend to operate, mm-hmm. I did start to wonder if that particular question to me was so out of place mm-hmm. and oddly timed that I made the assumption right then and there that there was going to be a connection later on in the show, in the episode.
I did the same thing. All right, so now the show moves along. Basically, they, of course, you got to have this ingredient. My favorite ingredient. This was my favorite ingredient. Chip coffee. So this is great that you can hear. This is fantastic. So I'm going to just play when they bring in Chip, and they always bring in Chip the same way. They would bring Chip onto the scene and then say, Chip, do you know Do you know anything about this place? Have we told you anything? So they would always introduce him and like try to prove to the viewer that he was coming